Welcome to Something to Wrestle With.
Something to wrestle with.
Bruce Prichard. Well, you know.
That's not a rib.
Well, I'm glad that Russo stepped in because he says that before he started helping write TV, the last show before his involvement was a 1.9 rating, one of the lowest that Raw had ever received. He says, so I guess you could say there was nowhere to go but up, and up we went. You can read all you want about creative teams and booking committees, but during the time I was writing with Vince, those were fictitious teams. There was no team and there was no committee. It was Vince and I, period. To this day, McMahon might not even admit that. For his own reasons, he wants you to think a group of writers gathered in a room every week to write TV. Well, maybe that's the case today, but back then it was just us, and the process worked like this. After we arrived home from Raw, I would work on all 11 segments for the following week's show on my own. I would look at our roster of players and make sure that everyone was involved in a storyline or angle. This was quite important to the process because at the time, all Vince cared about was the top 4 guys and what they were doing. My philosophy was the top 4 guys weren't going to be around forever, so we need to start building for the future. And that's how it all began. Me, my brain, and a computer. Once I had outline of the 11 segments, I would go to Vince's house the following day. Then I would pitch the entire show to Vince, and we would add his ideas. That usually consisted of a 10-hour day, just Vince and I sitting at his dining room table. I think this is where we complemented each other so well. I would just hit Vince with the big picture, and he would fine-tune it. Regardless of what has been said or what you may think, Vince hardly ever made drastic changes. He more or less went with what I had, adding his 2 cents to make it better. Remember, it's much easier to tweak a show than it is to sit down with a blank piece of paper and make something out of nothing. The next day, which was usually a Friday, I would format the show on my computer, and that's what it came down to, me and a hard drive. Here's where I went over it with a fine-tooth comb, from who would enter the ring first, to who would do the run-in, to who would go over, to whose music needed to be cued after the match, to the loser getting his revenge while the music was still playing. The final format involved everything, pre-tapes, live interviews, vignettes, commercial breaks, everything. Man, writing that was so tedious, so demanding. It took me an average of 8 to 10 hours to put the show on paper. From there, I would distribute it to everyone in the television production department. Then, usually around 6 p.m. on Friday, I would go to Vince's office with the formatted show, and we would tweak some more. The tweaking would go on all weekend and continue up to and even during the day of the show. But in reality, when we arrived to the building to shoot Raw, the show was 95% done. Vince and I used that system for the good part of 2 years, and I must say, it was magic. Bruce, is this the way you remember it going down? You weren't involved in any of this. Neither was Cornette or anybody else. It was just Vince and Vince at his dining room table.
For a long time, I mean, everybody that works in that creative process, that's very similar to how it works. So that's the way that it did work for a long time.
Anything else you want to add to that, or are we just going to sit here and stare at each other?
No, I mean, it's basically that's fairly accurate what he laid out, but it's always going to be Vince McMahon who's going to have the final say on what goes and what doesn't go. And he, as he said, he's going to tweak it. Vince is going to tweak it, and he's going to change it all the way up until it actually airs live on the show. But for the long time, and what Russo doesn't realize is that McMahon also, still called JR, still called me, and whoever the hell else that he called for ideas that would contribute in that. We all had access to the...
but you just weren't at the dining room table, you're saying?
No, we just weren't at the dining room table, no.
Do you believe that maybe McMahon thought Russo works best when he feels like it's just them two and there's no other outside influences?
That's fair to say, yeah.
Do you believe that this is what people mean when they say that McMahon was Russo's filter? Because he would bring him the ideas, and then Vince Russo prefers the term fine tune or throw his 2 cents in. Other people would say Vince was the filter. Isn't that
McMahon was the filter?
But that's kind of the same thing, is it not?
Yes.
If the idea still comes through him and he tweaks it or fine tunes it or whatever word you want to put on it, he's filtering it in another word. Is that fair?
Correct.
He says, working that closely with Vince, you couldn't allow your feelings to get hurt. I mean, at the end of the day, it was his company. If he liked something, he liked it. If he didn't, he didn't. Luckily, 9 times out of 10, he liked my stuff, which implies that he did at least filter one idea there, in his own words. Very, very rarely did we go toe to toe. I can only remember one time where I got really hot, and it was because he was caving in to the talent, and I knew it was wrong. It was the Highway to Hell SummerSlam, 1998. The main event being a match between The Undertaker and Steve Austin. Taker and Steve were hell-bent on going into the match with a respect for each other rather than a hatred. The reason was obvious. Behind the scenes, these guys got along. But the truth was, nobody cared if these guys went out drinking after a long day's rocking. They wanted to see them kill each other. Well, Vince caved, and the match sucked. It was Madison Square Garden, a full house, and nobody cared. After the match, Austin and Taker were both disappointed, and they couldn't understand the lack of crowd response. Hey, I could have told them, and did. Do you remember this at SummerSlam 98, that these guys really wanted to approach the match a different way that ultimately left it flat?
I don't know that it was left flat. I think that's a matter of opinion, but I do think that it is always going to be better when you have an audience and the audience has someone to root for and someone to cheer, to boo. And these guys felt that they should go in as equals, and they felt that they should go in, as he said, with a respect for one another. I didn't think that the match was bad, and I don't think that they shit all over it. I do know that, I don't think Steve and Taker thought it was their best effort. But that's just simply a matter of opinion. And that was something that the talent wanted to do. And Vince McMahon is always going to listen to the talent and will probably usually err on their side.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Russo did say there's lots of misconceptions about working with Vince McMahon that you wouldn't know unless you work closely with him. He says that Vince is not great at concepts, ideas, and big picture stuff. He's not this master everybody makes him out to be. But he believes that McMahon's forte, and the thing that he would blow him away with constantly, was that he could take things and make them a little bit better. Quote, he visualized things better than I ever could. It was a small tweak here and there that would turn a $50 million picture into a $100 million blockbuster. And that was Vince McMahon's genius, seeing things that nobody else could. Do you think that's a fair assessment, that maybe it's not always the big picture that's where Vince is best, but his short game is unbeatable?
You mean kind of like a filter?
Bingo. He also
but I do disagree also on the big picture thing, because I've always found, and again, it comes from 22 years versus 2 years, that his big picture is unlike anything I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, yeah, he told us like back in the, what'd you say, the mid 80s or late 80s, early 90s, he's talking about a network way before that was a real thing.
Yeah, and I'm thinking it's a cable network or
sure.
A regular television station.
Well, he probably was too. It's not like he's like, it'll be by Netflix, pal, in 1991.
Yeah. No, I know. You know what I mean. But no, he always did have those grandiose visions, always has, and probably still does today.
He also says one of Vince McMahon's best attributes, and this surprised me, was his patience, because I've never really considered McMahon to be a patient person. But Russo says when the ratings would come in every week, they'd all be sitting at his house, but Vince never had a strong reaction one way or another, even when they were losing the Nitro. He says that Vince would often joke, we worked damn hard for these threes. And this is a side of Vince McMahon we don't get to hear about very often. Does this version of him really exist? This patient, stay the course, it'll be okay in the end. There's no knee-jerk reaction. I think we as fans kind of armchair quarterback the booking and see when they hotshot something, and we assume, oh man, they're doing this already? They could have dragged this out a little more. This is over too soon. I wish there was more patience. But here Russo's saying, no, he could be very patient. What say you, Bruce?
He definitely could be. He could also be that knee-jerk son of a bitch too. And there were times, it's funny, and I guess in competition, when you're moving upward and you're happy with that, there's time to be patient. I think nowadays when he looks at the ratings and they go down, there may be more of a knee-jerk reaction to, God damn it, we got to fix this. So you get a little bit of both. I think it depends on his surroundings at the time.
Russo described the booking philosophy that he worked out with McMahon like this. We wrote every show to be better than the last, and every show as if it were our last. You see, there was a formula. Along with patience, Vince and I took every traditional wrestling outcome or finish and went the other way. Whatever the audience was expecting, give them the unexpected. Immediately, this brought unpredictability to the product, something it had been lacking for years. Baby faces would do heel things, and sometimes heels would even do babyface things. This was unheard of. It had been written in stone. A heel had to act one way, while a babyface acted another. Well, guess what? We threw that stone off the Brooklyn Bridge. There were no more rules and regulations. In your opinion, Bruce, how critical was this tweener style booking to the success of the Attitude Era, and does Russo deserve the bulk of the credit for it?
I think Russo deserves some credit for bringing it up and being able to sell that idea to Vince and to sell him to actually try it on and do it. It's nothing new, and it's nothing that hadn't been sold to him before. It was a new voice. It was a new sales pitch. It was some people used to say, it was the shiny new car. So he was listening to it more, and thank God he did, because it did help the business. And I do credit Russo for a lot of that. But it was, as Vince McMahon used to try to explain to everybody, we don't have black and white anymore. It's shades of gray. So the idea was that, that babyface could have more heel tendencies and vice versa. But the idea was to be unpredictable and to have must-see television. I think that eventually, which I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, it got to be the point of everything being a swerve, which after a while, your unpredictability
is predictable.
Predictable, yeah.
Russo says McMahon always positioned himself to be Mr. Invisible as far as, any sort of outside of wrestling folks knowing what he did. He specifically says that Kevin Dunn once invited him to meet with a bunch of TV executives, and Russo thought he wowed him. So when Russo followed up with Kevin Dunn about the next meeting, Dunn said he would no longer be needed in any of those meetings. Is this just Russo paranoia, or did man kind of like to keep his secret sauce secret?
It's probably Russo paranoia.
He also wrote that when the company was about to go public, that the PR company had sent out a prospectus printing up, all the featured people, the key people in the organization who made it tick. And there he was in all his glory, Jim Ross. I even think he had his cowboy hat on. If Jim Ross was more valuable to Titan Sports than I was, then Michael Jordan was more valuable to the White Sox than he was the Bulls. Ross and I weren't even on the same playing field. He played the role of yes man. I made a difference. Do you remember this prospectus and any sort of fallout from the staff beyond Russo here?
I don't remember any fallout beyond Russo. I do remember Russo's fallout on it. He felt that he had been slighted, but the prospectus was one of vice presidents and key people that were an officer in the company. Russo was not an officer.
He wrote, man, every magazine with a picture of Vince made me want to vomit. The guy was taking credit for everything, and I was nowhere to be found, not even a footnote. At first, it wasn't a big deal as long as Vince paid me. But the better we did, and the more Vince talked about himself, the more despondent I became. Vince the genius, yeah, right. This was the guy that gave the go-ahead for whose tag team partner what. Bruce, in your opinion, is being paid enough? Or do you need to get some sort of constant credit for everything you were ever associated with?
I don't know. He was just a writer, right? So how much credit did he really need? A minute ago, he said that he didn't take credit. Then he says he doesn't get enough credit. I'm totally confused on this.
Wrote that he was in a spot where he had to travel with Vince a lot. Quote, that was brutal. When we were on the road, I was attached to Vince's hip 24/7. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint a negative picture of the boss here, but it was taxing. You'd be working every passing minute the moment you got in the car. Whether it was a 30-minute drive or a 4-hour road trip, you were talking wrestling. Not the wife, not the kids. They didn't matter. All that mattered was the show. And the minute you fell asleep, the very second, he would take great joy in waking you up. At the very end of every trip, Vince would turn to me and ask, did I get it all? Referring to my energy, creativity, my entire life force. And I used to answer every drop. In essence, Vince was the vampire, and I was the poor, pale victim laying on the floor with the blood sucked out of his neck. The humor of it is that people actually used to envy me because I rode with Vince. Envy me, you can have him. You had the pleasure of traveling with Vince McMahon, Bruce. Is this fairly accurate?
That's a very good depiction. And though there were those of us that were extremely ecstatic when we didn't have to travel with Vince anymore. So yeah, that's very accurate.